Says, you know, he says, you were born in San Francisco. He says, after the war, when we win the war, I'm going to go have a drink at the top of the mark in San Francisco. And I said, ha. And he didn't like that particularly, but he smiled. He smiled and says, well, we've got you now. And I said, yep. And so we were kept there a couple of days, and pretty soon some older fellow walked in and said that he was from the Swiss Red Cross and he'd like to ask me a few questions. And I thought, I think they're playing games. So I wouldn't answer anything that he said. And then they put us on another boxcar and took us to Stalag Luft III, which was in near a town called Sagen in it was then Eastern Germany, but now Sagen is part of Poland. Anyway, that was my home until January 29th, 1945, when they marched us out of there because the Russians were approaching and the Germans wanted to keep us as bargaining chips for their safety too. And but we marched out. We were told we were going to be marching out at midnight, and we did. In the meantime, we were feverishly packing what we could into whatever we could. I had an old pair of pants, and I used that as a knapsack, and I managed to keep a diary that the YMCA gave us. That and a small Bible are the only souvenirs I had of the experience in Sagen. Well, I had a German dog tag too, which is now in the museum at Thorpe Abbott's, because I've given them whatever I had to display. That included a knife and fork from with the Nazi symbol on it. And if you ever get the chance, go over there. You'll see more about World War II than you ever want to know, but it's all true. It's really nice, and they're nice people over there too. They come to our reunions every so often. Anyway, from going back to POW, we marched for, I think 8 or 10 days. Believe me, it's getting a little dim now. But first night we spent in a church, and there was no bathroom available, and so the tombstones had to do. And that's what we used, if you know what I'm saying. Another night we were in a German barracks, and everybody got sick. And they marched us out at crack of dawn the next morning and didn't have to clean it up, thank you. But, and one night we were in a brick factory where we appreciated the warmth. One night we were in a bunch of stables. Anyway, we got down to a place, Spremberg I think it was, to get on another train and go down to Moosburg, which is about roughly 40 miles north of Munich. And that's the place we called the Snake Pit, because it really was. It was a camp designed for about 10,000, and there was over 100,000 in there. And some of the guys didn't have a barracks to sleep in. Some of them had to do with some sort of a makeshift tent. It was pretty rough, and the food was very poor. Most of our POW life was not too bad. We weren't treated as heroes, but we weren't abused the way our previous speaker had in Vietnam. I will say this, is the Germans in general, not all of them, but in general, they treated the prisoners reasonably well. I mean, that doesn't mean we had steak for dinner. We have a bowl of barley that would feed 8 men. Breakfast, Red Cross parcels got in as often as the trains were running, and sometimes we were winning the war by destroying trains, and sometimes we didn't get Red Cross parcels. Sometimes we would get what they call blood sausage, which was blood sausage. It was some sort of an undetermined meat packed in blood and put in intestine casings. We ate it. It wasn't the best, but I tried some later on, and it hadn't improved. I tried it. We went to Germany on a tour once, and I found a butcher that had some, and as I said, it hadn't improved a bit, but some people like that kind of thing. I don't know. Have I covered the bases pretty well?
I could just get up and walk off, sir. No, but honestly, going back to your time at the primary camp, you spent your time. How did you and your fellow prisoners stay apprised of what was going on? I know the propaganda machine was strong, so how did you get the real truth data?
Well, we had a radio that could pick up the BBC. We would also get the German version of how the war was going, and believe me, the two reports did not match. I don't know who had the radio, how they kept it, or anything, but we would all gather together with our own people acting as guards and lookouts to make sure the Germans weren't coming. And we would be read the news as it came. And this is not every day. Sometimes it was only once a week, sometimes a week or two between times. But we did it, and we knew that we were winning the war. When the invasion happened, the Germans gave us some German newspapers, and I still have one of those papers, at least the page that says that the invasion has begun, or something like that, on the title. And it had pictures of the FW-190s and ME-109s shooting at people, but they did relatively small damage. Thank goodness the invasion stuck on hold, because we were able to keep track of the advance of the armies across the European frontier. The radio that we had got all the news very well. The Germans in the meantime had captured the 70, I think it was 73 or 4 Brits that had dug their way out. You may have seen the movie about the Great Escape. That was pretty true. What did happen is that Hitler had ordered 50 of those recaptured prisoners shot, and they were mowed down. And we were advised of that one very cold morning shortly after it happened. They had a 6 o'clock roll call, called it appel. And Colonel Delmar Spivey was the commanding officer of our camp. And when he read this news about it, you could have heard silence. And it had a decided effect on all of us. We did try various escape plans, deliberately leaving it so that the Germans could find it. That did one thing: it caused the Germans to put more guards in the camp, and so that would reduce their ability to wage war. Maybe not much, even this much helped. And so that is one advantage that the prisoners of war had, that they could help in that way. And we didn't cause riots or anything, because that type of thing doesn't pay off. But just the subtle little escape attempts lets them know that we're still trying. And so, as I said, they had to have more manpower, and that did put a nick, a very small one, into their war machine. I don't know what more I can tell you.
That's perfect, sir.
That's my POW thing.
On par with Colonel Ellis's experience flying out of Vietnam, what was the environment like, the atmosphere, as the tanks knocked down the gates?
Well, down in Moosburg, we could hear the Russian guns, and we could hear them coming closer. And pretty soon it sort of stopped. And one day, I think I was inside, we heard a lot of shouting, and boy, here comes a GI tank coming right down the road, and he just went right through the gates, and that particular tank all of a sudden was swarmed like a mass of bees. It was swarmed with all the POWs. That was a very, very, very emotional day. We had 2 or 3 days after that until they could make arrangements to take us back. And I know several of us found a German warehouse, and I came out of there with a German helmet and a bayonet, a Nazi armband, and a pair of German officer pants, because my pants were pretty shreddy. And I wish I'd kept them, darn it. But anyway, they took us over to an airfield, not Ingolstadt or something like that, I think is the name. Anyway, they took us to an airfield there, and a DC-4 or 5 picked us up and took us back to Le Havre, where they had what they called Camp Lucky Strike. And we got deloused, and we got uniforms, and just overnight we turned from a bunch of straggly-looking people into officers and gentlemen again. I don't know about the gentleman part, but some of us didn't act like gentlemen, I'm sure. But I'll tell you one thing. When we landed there, and here we were, ragtag bunch of people, the French people there knew that we had been prisoners of war, and they were cheering us and throwing wine bottles to us, not at us. And believe me, we made use of it. But we got to enjoy the luxury of Camp Lucky Strike for a few days. And then most of us were put on not most of us, but some of us were put on a small Swedish steamer. But instead of going directly back to New York or the U.S., they had to drop somebody off down in the Caribbean somewhere at one of the little countries down there. So it took us about 10 days to get back to New York. And when I got back to New York, I got a phone call, or told I had a phone call. They stationed us at Camp Yaphank, I think it's called. That was a World War I camp too. And I was told that a friend of mine was going to be in New York. Well, it's a friend of my dad's, actually. My dad knew this movie director, Archie Mayo. I don't know if you've ever heard of him, but he's been long gone. But he and his wife took me and my brother, who had flown to New York, took us to dinner at the Copacabana, which was a high-grade nightclub at the time. And, you know, even today, it would be a very pricey place to go. And I thought, holy cow, where was I a month ago? It was very emotional at the time.
Outstanding. Well, sir, your outstanding stories have given us a snapshot into some of the time during World War II and being a prisoner of war. And I encourage everyone here to try to capture some more of Bob's story throughout the week, interact with him. But another significant date is coming up for you. On July 8th, 1945, you and Barbara are going to be celebrating your 70th wedding anniversary. So I'd like to recognize that. And Joseph here has some flowers for Barbara, and here's a picture behind us of your wedding day. So congratulations in life, your military service and beyond. You're an inspiration to us, and we look forward to working with you this week. And thanks again for coming down.
Thank you very much.